you all for coming to our first Salesforce Republic meetup of 2022. It's quite exciting. For those of you who maybe haven't heard of Salesforce Republic, or a bit new to the community, just to give you a bit of context, myself and colleagues at Third Republic founded the group a few years ago now to provide users and Salesforce professionals with the tools to optimize what they get out of the system. So for our event this evening, we're joined by Waqas, founder and CEO of DigitSec, who will be talking about how we can accelerate development by reducing false positives. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's great to be here together for the first time for 2022 and kicking this off and talking about how to accelerate Salesforce development. My name is Waqas Nazir. I've been doing software security for pretty much all of my career, and have had a fair share of bugs and security flaws reported to different enterprise development houses, and have had a fair share of discussions around false positives and what they can do. So I hope today everybody can have a interactive discussion around some of your experiences, but more importantly, sharing some knowledge around how to best address this problem. So our background is in security, and we do analysis of Salesforce orgs to identify security flaws. And our experience is that there is a big problem around false positives when you're trying to do security. So today we'll talk about what are false positives, why they're an issue, and an approach to addressing it, which is shift left. You may have heard of this term, and how that can help this overall problem within the development lifecycle. And then we'll jump into how can you shift left, and that is by using DevSecOps principles. And then what are some of those practices that you can do, and what are some of the challenges when it comes to Salesforce development. Those are basically based on our experience, what we've seen, and how can we measure success, how good are you doing if you're implementing security as part of your development. I always like to begin by sharing this quote, not always, but when I have the opportunity, is if you're trying to do security and you're trying to secure your environments, your Salesforce environments, it's very important to think like an attacker. Because if you always think from a perspective of, a normal user would never do this, you'll not find the security bugs that may be, exposed in your environment. The second you start thinking like a malicious user or an attacker, you tend to understand how somebody would go about attacking the system that I am building, and then allows you to find the relevant security flaws and address them. So if there's one key takeaway that you can have from this talk is, if you're trying to do security, think like an attacker, and then you will find the relevant things and be able to address them properly as well. So if we take a step back and look at security generally, we find that today security is a vertical which is used for many different purposes, mostly for cybercrime, for making profit. It's very profitable to hack. As you saw, that the average cost of a data breach continues to grow. In the US, it's anywhere from $5 to $7 million. We found that ransomware attacks are doubling every year. And there are things like, ransomware as a service, which basically means that you don't need any expertise. You'll just go buy something and then exploit an enterprise and, wait for the money to roll in. And sometimes you don't need to buy anything. You just have to share the cut from, whatever you make from getting ransom from companies. We know that the cybercrime industry itself is generating over $6 trillion. So it's very lucrative to be a hacker. And that, of course, creates more emphasis on the need for doing security because there are more and more people being attracted into this malicious activity. Now, we sometimes hear of those, $1 million payouts, but in actuality, there are a lot of small ransoms being paid by small businesses all the time because they don't, make the headlines. People don't get to hear of them, and it continues as status quo. But there is an added emphasis on addressing the larger security because everybody is being affected. We just don't get to hear about the small businesses and things like that. What we've seen now is that companies will threaten you fines, like especially organized cyber criminals. They would say, hey, if you don't pay up, not only will you lose your data and what have you, will actually report you to the authorities. So like they're using the legal system to extort more money out of people that are being compromised. We also saw the likes of SolarWinds, where it is estimated like 1,000 engineers worked on that exploit. So it was a very sophisticated attack, which required anywhere from 1,000 engineers to build something like that. So we have nation states very active in this field as well. So with that, let's jump into it, right? What are false positives? Why are they a problem? So here's a diagram that illustrates a typical life of a bug. So in the middle, we have a bug. It was found by a security person or a security researcher. They used a tool. It flagged this issue, and it was brought to the attention of the developers. The developers investigated it and then fixed it. And then it went back to the same person who reported it. The guy used the same tool, flagged the same issue again, went back to the developer. The developer went to the researcher saying, no, this is not a bug, we fixed it. And this kind of goes back and forth. And it takes about 16 iterations for this to be actually marked as a false positive. So of course, you can say that there are a number of breakdowns that happen in this process. But the main one is the tooling that was employed in identifying that bug was faulty. And that was basically the basis for this churn between security and the developers. And that basically is one thing that would delay any development lifecycle, right? Now, when it comes to building software, we know that you start with the design, you code, you build, and you have these various features. Now, this has been documented that if you find bugs in the different phases of your development, this is how much a bug costs, right? If you find it and you're actually writing the code, it's $80. But if you find something in production, it's close to $7,500, which you can see that it would make sense to find more and more bugs while you're coding versus when you're in production. Now, if these bugs happen to be security bugs, we know that regardless of when they're found, the impact is that when it comes to a SaaS platform like Salesforce, it could be $5 to $7 million because these bugs could potentially expose your data. And what's interesting is that traditional development was done on people's internal networks, developers building on their own machines or in their internal network. And then when it was ready, it was put in production. But now with the proliferation of Salesforce, the development is actually done externally, right? When you deploy a piece of code in your dev environment, it is exposed on the internet and your sandbox environments as well. So it is not that you don't have exposure now to your dev environment. So it's important not only to find these bugs early on, but actually to address them because they can cause problems as part of your development. So talked about this a little bit. We talked about the cost of fixing bugs, but we can see here that the level of effort that it takes to fix bugs in production is more than 30x compared to when you found it in the architectural and requirements gathering phase, right? Where we're spending literally 1x of your effort. So that again emphasizes the importance of shifting left. Traditionally, what we've seen is security has been done here. So once everything is done, that's when you test for security. This is the final product. Come tell us what's wrong. And that is basically, the last point in time where you can actually do something before you push the product out to the world. And that is actually not the best time, because as I've shown earlier, the time to fix, the cost to fix is much higher in this phase. So what we really want is security to shift left and be done like right at the onset. And that would enable you to have less bugs when it comes time to go live, but also the cost of fixing those bugs will be much lower. So what happens if you don't shift left, or if you don't address security, right? The question is, different, and it would mean different for everyone. But we know that having some downtime of a critical service like Salesforce is very detrimental to a business, right? It's the core element of any environment. Sales are driven, contracts are driven out of Salesforce. We now know that, verticals like healthcare and finance heavily relies on Salesforce. So having that service unavailable is not acceptable, right? The other is that you don't have any guardrails for your developers, right? They may be, developing and producing software at a faster pace, but you have no assurance on what actually is being developed and produced, right? You would not have any assurance on whether there's risk that we're operating in, and what is that risk. And you will basically be at the mercy of attackers. If somebody chose to attack you, they may find things, and if they didn't, you'll be fine for a while. The other important aspect of addressing security is that without it, you will create inconsistent software. So let's take, for example, if your development process does not address a ability to enforce role-based access, and there's no consistent way of enforcing that as part of your development. If that control doesn't exist, every time you ship, you do not know if your software is enforcing role-based access control or not. So that's one example of like how you produce not consistent in a non-consistent way. So if you wanted to implement DevSecOps or implement security as part of your development, what are some of the key principles? First is CIA. This is not the spy agency. You have to look at like what information that I have in Salesforce that needs protection from a confidentiality perspective. So this is information that I shouldn't disclose to external parties or to those who don't have a need to know. How can I make sure that those who have the ability to make changes are only the ones making changes in my environment? So that's termed as integrity. Also making sure that my environment has high level of trust, and only those who are authorized to make changes are the ones who are able to make changes. And then the last is availability. So those who should not have the ability to remove data or make it unavailable is an important aspect of making sure that you have a secure environment. That also applies to somebody being able to take your service down because you did not do proper testing around like the load, the amount of data that it can process. So all those things are important from a DevSecOps principle perspective. So in confidentiality, it means your data, your code and configs are protected, and they are not accessible and available to those who are unauthorized. Integrity, like I said, again, from a DevSecOps perspective, means you have to protect your data, your code, and the environment from the unauthorized alteration. The same applies to these three key principles from an availability standpoint, like your data as well as your code and your systems are, available for processing your business workloads. Now, if you were to divide these up in a practical way and divide these up between the two roles of a developer and admin, so let's take confidentiality, for example. So the developer's responsibility would be to enforce, make sure that those who have the permissions have the ability to read records. Your code enforces sharing rules. You enforce encryption to sensitive fields, and you protect against, let's say, SOCL injection attacks, right? For an admin, confidentiality will be enforced by not giving everybody, view all data or modify all data permissions, and making sure that you have proper role hierarchies. So only the users who have certain hierarchy within a organization have access to their records, and it rolls up to appropriate permissions. And then, creating secure sharing rules, basically making sure that the rules that you do have are not granting excessive access to all the records and things like that. Now, if we take integrity for a developer, this means that you enforce who can create and update records. You have to enforce the field level security. So not only the objects, but also the actual fields, which users have the ability to change them. And then you have to protect yourself against escalation of privileges. So if you're writing code that manipulates user permissioning and things like that, you have to make sure that that isn't that can be abused to get more access to the Salesforce environment. For the admins, this would mean that you implement proper role hierarchies, and you use permission sets, which are much more granular in nature. And again, never use or modify all data or view all data permission sets. So with availability, it's the similar theme, making sure that only those people who have the access are able to delete records, and you are enforcing FLS checks, and you're protecting against creating like overly permissive guest user policies and things like that, that could actually result in data breaches. And then the admin's responsibility is to basically test the applications to make sure that the integrations are available. And if you have large data sets, it doesn't make the application degrade itself or become unavailable for users. So the three important principles for DevSecOps is that you want to build secure apps. That is the responsibility of the architects, developers, DevOps, and security. You want to secure the app development itself, so then the environment, the user workstations, and things like that. That of course is the responsibility of DevOps, the developers, and the security teams. And then securing the apps in production, which is a shared responsibility between all of the key players in an environment. So here's a sample development pipeline where we talk about what are the key things that you can do to do security right, which will help accelerate your development. We think that you need 4 key things to do security right for a Salesforce environment. So as part of your dev process, we recommend doing 1 is static code analysis, which is basically looking at the code and making sure that there are no security bugs within the code. But then the second thing that we recommend doing is dynamic analysis, which is basically simulating a malicious attacker in that environment. So taking the bugs that you find through code analysis and using those bugs to actually exploit an environment and then see if these are valid bugs or not. Because without this process, you will not be able to ascertain what's really exploitable and what's not. And this is a key way of reducing false positives, right? If you take a bug that comes out of code analysis and then you try to exploit it and it's not exploitable, then you know that there's some business logic that's preventing this bug from being exploited. That's not to say that you shouldn't fix this issue. Maybe it's a lower severity. It's not an urgent thing that you need to address. But if you find a bug and you're actually able to exploit it, that would be the first bug that I would fix, because it's 100% real. It's not false positive, and there's actually an exploit available for it, so anybody can use it. So that's the second thing that we recommend. The third thing is analyzing the composition of your environments. So Salesforce allows you to use third-party libraries, allows you to use third-party components, some from AppExchange, some from non-AppExchange components. So there is some third-party risk as part of the Salesforce development. And unless you analyze that risk, you will not know about it. And we recommend that, that is the other element that's required to do security right for Salesforce. And then the last thing that we recommend is, Salesforce can be configured in many different ways, and each configuration can have a security implication. So we recommend that, that is another element that is looked at from a security perspective to make sure that there's nothing that is going to cause a security issue down the pipeline. So with these 4 key things, you can implement them in different parts of your pipeline and ensure that, all through your pipeline, your data and your code is secure, and you'll have less and less bugs as you go closer towards, deployment. And then eventually in monitoring, all you're looking for is like third-party risk and configurational issues. The other, good practices that we've seen which help teams accelerate development is implementing zero trust, which is basically saying that assume that everything is malicious. So every piece of code, every config change is malicious until proven otherwise. And that has really helped teams address security from the get-go. So assume that the feature that you're developing is going to be exploited by, internal users or external users, and then seeing what controls do you have in place to protect your application is the best approach that we've seen for addressing security. A lot of assumptions are made when you create trust in an environment. So you'll say, we can trust our architect to create the right solution. And that's true, but you do not have 100% assurance that the architect will not make a mistake. So when you create zero trust, it's not that you don't trust people, it's that you need to be assured yourself that whatever you're developing is actually resilient and secure. And that is done by, creating this principle of zero trust. The second principle that we've seen is like implementing security at the earliest stage of your development. If that means that's user stories, that's where you want to start talking about security. And that would help your overall acceleration of your development. The third is like, what we've seen is like, you may have a very resilient organization now in which you rely on a few developers or maybe an admin to do the right thing. But what happens when, that admin or that developer changes roles or moves on? All of a sudden you find your, development lacking. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're relying on some key personnel and not having a process around what you're doing, which somebody else can pick up and then do. So it's important to do some maturity level checks on your developers and admins, and then use ongoing training to continue to improve their maturity from a security perspective. What are some of the challenges that we've seen when it comes to Salesforce, security and DevSecOps? We've seen that there tends to be a lack of ownership, like who owns security, whether it's the developers, the security teams, or the admins. So sometimes that is kind of lost in the middle somewhere. So it's very important to define like who is ultimately responsible in your organization, and that would be the people who are running all the various elements of your development security. The second is not too relevant to very technical people, but there is a lack of understanding between SaaS versus platform as a service. People think that since Salesforce is a SaaS environment, we don't have to worry about the security. But Salesforce, of course, does its part. But as consumers of Salesforce, we are responsible for like the changes that we make to the platform. So sometimes that lack of understanding creates a challenge for doing security. The other challenge that we face with Salesforce DevSecOps is there's not a lot of good tooling available. The tools that are available, they are sometimes open source or only looking at one aspect of security. So they generate a lot of noise, a lot of false positives, which of course delays development, and it undermines the reason why you implemented security in the first place. And then the last thing is that there is lack of visibility. You're not unable to measure like how good you're doing. So until you implement security, you cannot really measure it. So it's kind of a circular problem that you face with Salesforce development. So how can you measure, DevSecOps success? One is acceleration, right? So if you're doing security now, and if you're not doing it the right way, it probably is causing delays. But if you start implementing security early on by shifting left and using the appropriate tools at the appropriate time, how much does that accelerate your overall pipeline? We've seen that one team was able to save about 1,000 developer hours in 5 months by doing security right. So they were doing security before, but it was causing a lot of delays for them. But once they started doing security properly, they were able to get acceleration of their existing process. The other thing is that how scalable is your process, right? I talked about this before. If you have one developer doing manual code reviews, if you start increasing the velocity of your development, is that one person is going to require 2 persons, 3 persons. So you have to understand like how scalable your process is. And if it's not scalable, then you want to look at that scalability. And then the other thing is like how flexible your process is. Like is it very stringent to the point that if you changed a few things as part of your development, it will basically break the entire pipeline. And if that's the case, then that's a drawback that you want to move away from. The other like very critical component of DevSecOps is traceability. You may be doing security, but what's the end result, right? Are you actually able to address risk, right? Not just identify it. So having metrics around, hey, we found X number of issues and X types of issues, but we only addressed 20% of them through our development practices, but the other 80% are not being addressed. And what's the reason for that? So having some pipeline analytics built on top of your DevOps will help continue to mature your DevSecOps practices. So this brings me to the conclusion of the talk. Basically, we know that breaches are messy, they're expensive, nobody wants them, but that they have become an unfortunate reality of being on the web, being connected. But that is not to say that you cannot do anything about it. Security should be the key element of any development on Salesforce, because without it, you don't have any assurance. And then developers should be incentivized and encouraged. So if developers are producing more secure code, They should be measured and they should be recognized for those efforts. Security tends to be like the stick on your hand. Why did you do that? But security also needs to recognize when things are done right. The other point is that security is a process, not a destination. So if somebody was to come to you and tell you that some system is like 100% secure, they will be lying, because there is no such thing. There's so many dependencies on so many things that that statement in itself is wrong. But taking security as a process that you can implement to reduce risk is the right approach. And that would be the recommendation that we would make. Security is, as I said, a team sport. You have admin, developers, architects, everybody who's involved in the process, be part of that overall process. And that's very important to understand, that everybody has to play their role to do this right. And aside from all the arguments that I've made, security is the right thing to do, because this day and age, you cannot just hope that nobody is going to look, right? That's not a strategy. That's not something that's going to affect the overall operation of your company. You have to do something about it, and it's the right approach to addressing a key area in your environment. So with that, I'll pause and open up for any questions.
You mentioned at the start of your presentation, the acronym CIA. Out of those three aspects, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability, is there like one that you think might be more important for admins and developers to focus on, or are they all equally as important as each other?
I think it really depends on like the vertical you're in. I think all three of them are important, but let's say if you have very sensitive data and all you care about is that data not getting out, then I think confidentiality is the most important one. But if you have data that you don't want to be altered, for example, you're a financial institution and you record transactions. So if somebody can go in and change a few zeros, that could be critical for your organization. So I think it really varies from organization to organization, but generally having controls on all three areas would be the best approach. But I think people can make intelligent decisions based on their use case, on like what's really the most important for us. Somebody finding out the size of the transaction, or somebody changing that transaction, right? So for somebody it would be like, I don't want anybody to change any zeros anywhere, right? and that would become their focus, is like integrity is paramount to us. We don't care if somebody does find out that we made this much money, but if somebody was to change how much money we made or how much money we lost, that's going to be critical for us. So I don't know if that helps answer your question.
No, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. So we've had a question in the chat. What do the acronyms MAD and VAD stand for that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, very good question. So in Salesforce, there's a permission set that allows you to give access to users called modify all data, which basically means that regardless of what use case that user has, they can modify all data. So if you've implemented role-based access control and you give this permission to someone, that person or group of people would have basically complete access to all data. They can change records, they can delete records, they can update them, they can create them. So that's basically MAD. It's aptly defined, I think. And then the second is VAD, which is view all data. So this would be basically a user's ability to view all data regardless of what they had as far as their role-based access control. So if these two flags are checked for a user which is non-administrative or there's no use case for it, this is like a big flag from a security perspective.
You mentioned the importance of like ongoing training. I was just wondering if you had any sort of resources you could recommend.
Yes, so there are some good trailheads which are available on the topic of permissions. I think for admins, I highly recommend them on how to create your permission sets, your permission groups, as well as the roles and role hierarchies, and creating a robust access control model. That's one. And for developers, there's a Salesforce security guide that's published by Salesforce, which talks about all the different things that they should be aware of when developing on the platform. Third that I can share is like the OWASP rule set. So customers of Salesforce who are using it for like app development, they should look at OWASP top 10 rules as well.
When you were talking about the challenges of like security and things like that, you talked about the lack of visibility. Is there a way, is there anything you can recommend for overcoming that challenge in particular?
Yeah, I mean, not to plug in our product, but that's essentially what we do is we look at Salesforce deployments and we find what's the risk with the code that's in this development, in this environment, what's the configuration risk, what's exploitable, what's the third-party risk. So that's one. Salesforce also provides a good nifty tool, health check, which does a good job of looking at the configurations and telling you if there's something like really bad that you can address quickly. And then of course, there's some other tools. We have a partner that does mapping sensitive fields in your orgs. So there's some tooling that's available that can give you some more visibility into the Salesforce environment that you're managing.
Thank you again to Waqas for taking the time to obviously talk about this. I think what you've mentioned is really insightful. And yeah, and thank you everyone for attending our first event of 2022. Stay tuned for more.